not going to try to get y'all in trouble here at the moment, but how many of you at some point in your past as you were growing up pushed the boundaries of what you could get away with a little bit now and then? Anybody? Just a few of you are telling the truth, aren't you? No comment? Yeah, exactly. Is that what it is? Well, we when you wanted to do something and you knew you probably shouldn't, how many of y'all reasoned in your mind a way to get it done? Yeah. We played that game, God doesn't really care about that. So let me see if any of you show hands used one of these types of things. And I promise, the statutes of limitations has expired at least a couple of days ago for some of y'all. Parents won't be informed unless they are sitting right there, and I don't think any criminal charges will be filed. But how many of y'all played the game of God doesn't care, how I dress? That's usually a girl thing more than a guy, but it still happens. God doesn't care what I watch, right? God doesn't care who I date. God doesn't care, the music I listen to or other things or the people that I listen to, right? Anybody play those games before in some level or another? Are there other games that I'm missing? Because I know I played all of those games. We play this game because we want to do something, but we don't want to let something as inconvenient as what God thinks or as inconvenient as our faith get in the way. We play the game because on some level we're afraid that he really does care about certain things, right? There's a part of us that knows, and that's why we play the game. He does put limits and restrictions on us, doesn't he? When it comes to how I dress, how revealing can I get away with on something here, right? What I watch, does that mean pornography is okay? If he doesn't care, can I watch pornography? No, he's going to put a limit on that, right? If I date somebody, is it okay that I date somebody who's not a believer? I know sometimes it works out, but you're walking into something, you can get yourself in trouble. Does it matter what I listen to? Even country music. Okay, maybe not the old country, just the new country, right? But is it safe to say that God does care about some things? He cares about a lot of things. He cares about more things than we realize. Because the reality is we don't have an anything goes type of God. Not for us as individuals, not for us as the people of God, not for us as the whole body of Messiah. He's not anything goes. He's not do whatever you want or whatever comes into your mind. And that leads me to the next excuse for why sometimes our friends and our family don't want to come along with us on this journey or do the things that they see us doing. We've looked at 11 of these so far. I'm not Jewish. Yeshua, Jesus, he fulfilled the law. The law was nailed to the cross. I'm a new covenant believer, as if that cancels out everything that's in the past. There's some distinction between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. There's all the things that we've done my whole life, and I'm not going to change things now, right? That the Gentiles shouldn't be doing all this stuff anyway, or something that's sometime off in the future in the kingdom. That's not for now. These are just shadows of the Messiah. We talked about why we don't need Passover anymore because that's been fulfilled and it's done. Or then last time we looked at, I thought God was done with the Jewish people. And several of these are going to factor in as motivators with today. And today's excuse is more. It's more than just practices and preferences for things. It's something really central to our belief. It's not so much what we believe. We still are believing that very orthodox in our faith and our understanding, but it's how we practice our faith. That's the word orthopraxy. What we do, when we do it, and how we do it. So whenever we talk about the feast, whenever we talk about the Sabbath, or any number of things for where we are and doing what we're doing, how we worship God. Even when we talk about worship, we play the same game. That God doesn't care how we worship. And I don't need to come along with you and do that because God doesn't really care. Now that we're in the new covenant era, God doesn't care how we worship. I'm free to do what I want any old time. Isn't that how the song goes? Because Jesus came and did away with all those legalistic regulations and sacrifices, we're free to introduce or replace those things with new things because the old has gone and the new has come. After all, we can't pour the new wine into old wineskins, right? The temple's been destroyed, and that just proves that God has judged the system that was set up there, that system of worship in the temple, along with even more than the people itself. And so we are free to worship in a new way, not bound in the old system. We're free to gather in worship even on a different day, not on the Sabbath. We're free to have new holidays and not do any of the old feasts. We're no longer bound by anything that Abraham did, anything that Moses did, anything that David did at the temple, because what we have in Christ is something completely new. So in our day, again, God doesn't care how we worship. But just like before with what we wear, just like before with what we watch or who we date or marry, what we listen to, there's a part of us that on some level knows that that's just not really true. We know that there are some limits and boundaries. For example, God not caring does not mean, right? It doesn't mean that, hey, it's okay for me to bring, Hindu temples and idols and mantras and chanting into church worship. Yes or no? Does anybody say that God not caring means it's okay to do that? Oh. So there's a limit. God not caring means it's okay to mix worship with pagan worship practices like the pentagrams, the spell castings, and the contacting the dead. Is that okay? No. Still not okay. It's okay to bring in an Asherah pole like they did. They put that right in the temple at one point or another. And we can call on Baal because all religions are really the same, right? No, the answer for that is still no. Or it's okay to use a stripper pole and dancers in church, which happened around here, by the way. See, when we talk about what's true and not true worship, there are certain things that we understand are on the outside. Those Hinduistic practices, the Asherah pole, pagan things, all that, right? But then, so those things might be more obvious to us. But then we kind of move in a level. What about snake handling? Is that still off the limits? Yes, absolutely. Very much so, right? What about, as much as you may like heavy metal music, is it really good for worship? See, now it's starting to hurt a little bit more, isn't it? Right? Well, all the smoke machines and fog machines, all those kind of things, right? So then it goes even in a little bit further. What about, all that holy laughter stuff that you see in different places? Or what if that, worship only happens if you're using the King James? Or all the choruses that go on and on and on for like 30 minutes of repeating the same thing over and over again, right? That gets a little more challenging, does it? Does God have an opinion on some of these types of things, in other words? See, you may not think that he cares, or you may know people that think he doesn't care. but on some level you know that he does. You know, if you went to a church that had a lot of those things going on, would you want to stay there? Or would you leave? See, the hard part is that we continually move the line to what is acceptable worship, because it's really, the question is, who is setting the standard? You know, who has greater knowledge of what is true and acceptable worship? Is it you or is it God? God does. He knows what is true and acceptable worship. The one being worshiped, the one worthy of worship, the one who's not just inviting worship, but even commanding worship. He knows and determines what is and what is not worship. Because here's the biggest mistake that we make when you hear this kind of excuse. Well, God, it doesn't really matter when or how or what I do in worship. The biggest mistake with all of that is that this is what it really boils down to. The things that I don't like and the things that I'm not comfortable with, well, that's not really worship. Which makes what is really worship the things that I do. The things that I do like, the things that I am comfortable with, the things that I've grown up with. You know, saying God doesn't care how we worship or how we celebrate Him is less a statement about Him, and it's more a statement about you. Because the excuse, who's in control of what is true worship when you say that? God doesn't care how we worship. Who's in control? We are. It lets us be the one to determine what is and is not worship. You know, God sees me. You know, God knows my heart. God knows my intention. So that must mean that everything I want to do is okay and acceptable to Him. Right? Because He knows what I intend to do. As if we know what true worship is better than Him. As if we know what offends Him more than He does. You know, just because we do stuff, just because we sing songs with Jesus in it, or we do holidays and talk about Jesus and read the Bible, just because, as we were talking about earlier, we need a Jesus salt shaker where we sprinkle a little bit of Jesus on top of something. Just because we do it in His name does not mean that He is then obligated or required to accept it, obligated to receive it, automatically pleased with it. It doesn't mean it's worship. Y'all remember this verse from Matthew 7? He says, "Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we drive out demons in your name? Didn't we perform many miracles in your name? Did we not sing in your name? Did we not put up beautiful decorations in your name? Or did we not take off work and make it a federal holiday and spend lots of money and give lots of gifts and eat lots of ham, all in your name?" Right? We play this game, right? I'm not the only weird one, am I? To you and to me, for most of our lives, there's nothing wrong with any of that stuff I just said. We would say all of those things are good. We would do all of those things to please Him. We would call all of that a form of worship or a form of service. But His opinion might be very different than ours. His acceptance of those things might take into a much greater account things other than our intentions. Because He says what? Even though, many will say to me on that day, didn't we prophesy in your name, drive out many demons in your name, perform many miracles in your name? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness. And that statement, I never knew you, is another way of saying that I was not a part of that. I didn't ask you to do that. I do not consider any of that you just say you did in my name. I don't consider that worship. Get away from me, he says. That's another way of saying, rather than pleasing me, it actually offends me. You see it? You have taken my name and associated it with something that it shouldn't be associated with. You've taken something holy and you've mixed it with something profane. You've misused it. That's taking his name in vain, right? We're not supposed to do that, right? Get that stuff away from me. Do not connect my name with that stuff. And the many who did all of that stuff, who thought that they were doing good, thought that he would be pleased, thought that he didn't care what they were doing, didn't care how they were doing it. So long as the name of Jesus gets credit for it, they did what they wanted to do and expected or even demanded him to receive it. But what they wanted was not the standard. He says, depart from me. Get away from me. Workers of iniquity. Iniquity is really the wrong word. Lawlessness is the better word. Anomia, without the law. You who are not keeping the standard laid out in the law, laid out in the Torah. Worship in keeping with, worship consistent with the Torah. Get away from me, you who are not doing all that stuff consistent with the Torah. That's the standard. So he has greater knowledge of what is true worship. And when we talk about establishing what is or is not worship, the question is, has God expressed his will? Has God expressed his opinion about what is or is not true worship? Yes or no? Yeah. He has a lot. We're in Leviticus in the Torah cycle. Proper worship is one of its primary themes, right? Adonai reveals his expectation of worship throughout the Torah. And he also says this is the consequence when you don't. There's that moment just a couple of weeks ago, the sons of Aaron show up with strange or unauthorized fire in Leviticus 10. Y'all remember that? Some various explanations are there. Some say they'd been drinking. Maybe they used the wrong formula of incense, which was very specific. Or maybe they came at the wrong time on the wrong day. They did something wrong in their attempt to worship. And they must have excused it. They must have played this same game and thought that Adonai, he won't mind, he doesn't care. But they were killed because of it. Fire came out from his presence and consumed them. Where in chapter 16, when that's revisited, it says, Adonai spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they approached the presence of Adonai and died. Does God care how we worship? Because Adonai said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at just any time into the holiest place behind the curtain, before the atonement cover which is on the ark, so that he would not die. For I will be appearing in the cloud over the atonement cover. Don't just walk in here whenever you feel like it or whenever you want to. God, he's throughout the Torah, expresses his will, his expectation in great and specific detail. He talks about offerings and sacrifices, just even to the amounts of grain or wine, and it's even talked about in terms of being cooked in certain ways, right? Y'all have read this stuff, right? He's very detailed. The priests even had to be wearing the right kind of clothes, the certain robes, and they have different robes on certain days, all to come into the presence of the king and worship him. This week's Torah portion includes some of the most detailed elements of worship in chapter 23. This talking about those holy days, the appointed times, the designated days of meeting, the moedim, and with specific instructions for what month and what day that they should be on. God sets this appointment, and just like the priests, just like he's telling Moses here and Aaron here, we can't just show up when we want to, but we should show up when he says to. Imagine, the president contacting you, whether you like him or not. Any president would be really like this, contacting you and saying, you know what, I want to meet with you this Monday at 12 p.m. at the Chop House next to Bass Pro Shops. And we're going to discuss you taking on the role of, national security advisor. That's what we're going to talk about. And you get the message and think, man, I'd love to be his national security advisor, but I can't really meet then at that time. I'll be at work and it's too far away. So instead, you send a message back saying, I'll go to the Longhorn Steakhouse Sunday night at 6 p.m. And you expect the president to be there waiting for you. And you're shocked that he didn't adjust his schedule to what was more convenient for you. Anybody shocked that he didn't adjust his schedule? And when he doesn't show, you say, well, I guess he's not coming. I guess it's not that important. Right? When in fact, it's the other way around. He's still going to show up on Monday at 12 p.m. at the Chop House. And he's going to say, well, I guess he's not coming. I guess she's not coming. I guess this isn't important enough for you to keep this appointment. See, we don't set the appointment. God does. We don't have the authority to change the appointment. Only he does. If he contacted us and said, you know what, the Chop House thing's not going to work, 12 o'clock's not going to work, let's meet at 2 at this other place, then fine. He can do that. We don't have the authority to change the appointment. Only he does. And really, is he going to change the appointed times? Is he going to change any of this stuff? No. He's going to keep his word. The first and most common appointed day happens every week. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, these are the appointed feasts, the Moedim of Adonai, which you are to proclaim to be holy convocations, gatherings. My Moedim. These are his. He says, work may be done for 6 days, but the seventh day, this is the first one listed, is a Shabbat of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You are to do no work. It is a Shabbat to Adonai in all your dwellings, wherever your dwelling happens to be. The Sabbath is a day God designated as a day of appointment, a time of convocation, 52 times a year. A day set aside for meeting with him, gathering with his people, hearing his word. He didn't say, I really don't care what day you show up on. Just pick one. Come and any day that you want. Really, and really, it doesn't really even matter that you set the whole day aside. Just maybe a 2-hour block in the morning before all the football games start. This chapter goes on to describe all the other feast days, Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, all in that first month, starting at the full moon, then counting of the Omer for 49 days leading up to the Feast of Weeks, what we also call Pentecost. Then there's this break until the 7th month for the Feast of Trumpets, which is on the new moon. 10 days later is the Day of Atonement and Tabernacles, and the 15th day, again on the full moon. This is how God describes all of his holy days, his days of appointment, these days of proper worship. And he cares so much that we meet and worship with him on those days. He cares so much that we'll be able to know when those days are, that he actually made the sun and the moon to help us keep track of it. Then God said, this is Genesis 1, let lights in the expanse of the sky be for separating the day from the night, and they will serve for signs and for seasons. They're to get your attention, to signal you, to direct you for the Moedim, and for days and for years. The seasons are not talking about, spring, summer, fall, and winter. There are these feast days. Again, the sun and the moon and the stars exist in this universe. One of their primary purposes and functions is to help us know when to worship him, when to come and meet with him on his designated days. So to make up our own days, to pick our own times based on our own, calculations, is to reject the purpose of those lights and reject the authority of the one who made them for that purpose. Having our own holidays means that we really don't believe Genesis 1. Which is weird, because if you ask most of the creationists, would they say they believe Genesis 1? Oh, yeah. But whether they do it intentionally or not, effectively, they're rejecting the creation, because they're rejecting the purpose of why they are there doing what they are doing. Because if the heavens declare the glory of God, right, they do so by defining the Moedim, the feast days, when he wants to meet with us, and we are supposed to go and meet with him. And what do we do when we do that? We praise him. We glorify his name. We honor him. God knows what true worship is better than any of us, and he has expressed his opinion in his word for what true worship is. So what it really all boils down to in all of this is, does God have the authority to control or to determine what is true worship for all of his people? Yes or no? Does he have the right? Does he have the authority to say one way or the other, I want you to do this, I don't want you to do that? Does he have the authority to do that? Yes, he does. Is he the authority, or are we the authority? He is. Is it about what you and I want, or what he wants? What he wants. God doesn't care really means I don't care what he says. That I am the authority. That's what God doesn't care really means. I'll do it the way that I want to do it, the way that I think is right, which usually means I'm going to keep doing what I've always done. I'm not going to make any changes. I'll figure out, I'll make a theological reason or excuse for why I'm doing something different from what I read in the scriptures. So a lot of those previous excuses that we've already covered come in here. I can keep doing what I'm doing because, Jesus fulfilled the law. The law's done away with. It's been nailed to the cross. I can keep doing what I'm doing in worship, because we're in the new covenant, and the old covenant's obsolete and done away with. I've been doing it this way my whole life. When God destroyed the temple, he destroyed that way of worship. Right? These are all things that are said out there. And I find that last one a little bit amusing in some ways because of its lack of perspective. Because, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, was that the first time that happened? That was the second time. He destroyed the temple in 586 BC. Did the temple ever come back after that? I'm just kind of wondering. Did that form of worship get reinstated after that? Does the temple talk about the temple? Does the scriptures talk about the temple returning in the future in some form or fashion that we may not understand. The temple is there in Revelation chapter 11. He even measures the courtyard. He counts the worshipers in it. That's when the two witnesses show up. See, the first time the temple was destroyed was because of a long line of kings not keeping the Torah, not worshiping God correctly, worshiping other gods, combining and mixing with other practices, things that they're told not to do. Don't worship me like the other nations. Sometimes they're even putting that stuff in the temple. True worship was not judged when the temple was destroyed, but the corruption of worship was. That's what was judged. True worship and true worshipers would have recognized, in the Second Temple era, they would have recognized the arrival of Messiah. It was the rejection of Messiah that was judged, not the temple or the temple forms of worship. Because God gave not only the design of the tabernacle, the design of the temple, all of its furnishings, also He even gave the service and the order itself. When King David passed on the responsibility of building the temple to Solomon, he says this in 1 Chronicles. He says, "Consider now, for Adonai has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Chazak, be strong, and do it." And then David gave Solomon, his son, the pattern of the porch, its houses, its storerooms, its upper rooms, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement. And I want you to notice the source of where he gets all of this from. And the plan of all that he had by the Ruach, or the courts of the house of Adonai, and all the surrounding rooms for the storehouses of the house of God, and for the treasuries of the dedicated things. So, what's the source for David in this design? The Spirit is. He's listening to the Spirit of God. The Spirit directed and designed even the order of service. There's also for the divisions of the priests, the Kohanim, and the Levites, for all the tasks of the Avodah, or the service of the house of Adonai, and for all the vessels of service of the Avodah in the house of Adonai. So even how the priests worked and operated, the divisions and tasks of the Levites, which was just a few chapters earlier from this in chapters 23 through 25, and where he talks about all the precepts. Some of them were the Levites, were some designated as singers. Others were designated as instruments in charge of praise. Not necessarily telling them each and exactly every song that they had to sing, but if he's setting up an order of Levites to be singers, what is one thing that he expects? Kind of expects some singing going on, right? If he sets aside some to be devoted to prayer, what kind of things does he want a part of the service? Prayer. If he has some set aside and designated for reading the Scriptures, what does he expect to be a part of the service? Reading of the Scriptures. He even talks about musical instruments. So that means we can have all the drums we want, right? You know how much of a controversy it was to put drums in church once upon a time? Yes, you do. So he may not give every detail of every song and everything, but there are certain things that he wants to be a part of his service. David then says in verse 19, says, "All this I put in writing is from the hand of Adonai upon me, as he gave me insight regarding the plan of all the works." So what's the source? The hand of Adonai. And so when somebody says, well, the temple was destroyed, that means God was judging the temple service and everything, all that kind of worship that's happening there. That's kind of an odd statement, isn't it? God designed the temple and the temple service, the form of worship. But if he was judging that, that means he's like, you know what? I think I was wrong in how I organized all of that. I should never have told them to organize the priests that way. I should never have told them to do all the things in the temple that way. Is he going to have that kind of attitude about his word? No. Even this Torah service that we did today, even the synagogue service in general, is in many ways a historic attempt to maintain or recreate some elements of this temple service that he's talking about. Getting away from all of that stuff because God doesn't care is exactly how all the bad kings of Israel and Judah were determined. Because they corrupted the Torah's command of worship. They call, and you see it repeated in Scripture all the time. They were continuing in the sin of Jeroboam. Y'all heard that name before? Who for political reasons was changing worship, the worship of God. It says Jeroboam said in his heart, 1 Kings 12, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. They had just split, and he's afraid of all of his people going down and being more devoted to Jerusalem and the house of David. And he's like, man, I've got a problem. I've got to fix that. If this people keep going up to offer sacrifices in the temple, in the house of Adonai at Jerusalem, for all of those feast days, the pilgrimage feasts and such, then the heart of these people will turn back to their Lord, to King Rehoboam of Judah. Then they will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. And he's probably right in this political calculation. That probably would happen. So he comes up with a plan. The king sought counsel and made 2 golden calves. He said to them, you've been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Then he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one even up in Dan. He also made shrines on the high places and appointed priests from among the people who were not sons of Levi. It says, then Jeroboam instituted a festival in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, imitating the festival that is in Judah. And he went up to the altar that he built in Bethel to sacrifice to the calves that he had made. He installed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he made. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that he had made up from his own heart. He had good intentions, right? God will know my heart when I'm doing it this way. Maybe God doesn't care how and when we worship. You think he's playing the game? Oh yeah, he's playing the game. And he made up a festival for the children of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense. What Jeroboam is doing here defined many of the kings that followed him, and they were all judged as doing evil in the sight of Adonai by continuing in this sin. And what he did was little different than what happened to the believers out there among the Gentiles away from the Jewish people, in the centuries after Yeshua, as they became more and more hostile to the Jewish foundation, to the Jewish people. The sin of Jeroboam was continued, where they changed the form of worship, introducing various idols and statues and all other kinds of things. They changed the place of worship from Jerusalem. We can't use that place anymore. That's too closely tied to the temple. That's too closely tied to those Jews. So let's make it someplace else. Constantinople, Rome, various other places. They changed even the priesthood. Anybody can be a priest. They don't have to be a descendant of Levi or descendant of Aaron. And then they changed the dates. You noticing a pattern? The bad kings followed that pattern. It's the good kings are the ones that returned to Adonai and his ways, that outlawed worship of other gods, that destroyed the high places, that removed the Asherah poles and the pillars, knocked those down, ways that God did not want to be worshipped. Like Hezekiah was one of those kings. Like when Josiah found the Torah, the book of the law in 2 Kings chapter 22, he realized that reading the scriptures that God really did care about worship. So he stopped false worship and restored true worship. All right, 2 Kings 23 says, the king went up to the house of Adonai, and all the men of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests, the Kohanim, and the prophets, all the people, young and old, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of Adonai. And then the king stood by the pillar and cut a covenant before Adonai to follow Adonai, to keep his mitzvot, his laws, and his decrees with all his heart and soul, in order to fulfill the words of this covenant that were written in this scroll. And so all the people did what when they heard the reading of the covenant? They stood. Right? They stood for the covenant. Then the king commanded Hilkiah, the Kohen Gadol, the Kohanim of the second order, and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of Adonai all the vessels made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven, and he burned them outside Jerusalem in the field of Kidron, and took their ashes to Bethel, of all places. And after destroying all kinds of false worship, then Josiah reinstates true worship. Then the king commanded all the people, saying, celebrate the Passover to Adonai your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. For no Passover like this has been celebrated from the days of the judges who judged Israel, or in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was observed for Adonai in Jerusalem. Moreover, Josiah got rid of all the false worship, the necromancers, the mediums, the teraphim, and the idols, and all the detestable things that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, in order to confirm the words of the Torah that were written in the scroll that Hilkiah the Kohen found in the house of Adonai. Before him there had never been a king like him. Is he a good king or a bad king? He's a good king because he did all that. Who turned to Adonai with all his heart and with all his soul, with all his might, according to all the Torah of Moses, nor has any king like him risen since him. The bad kings went away from the Torah. They were lawless and instituted false worship. Josiah was a good king because he repented of false worship and sought to restore true worship. Now here's the kicker. Yeshua is going to be king one day, isn't he? Messiah is going to be a king, seated on the throne. What kind of king do you think he's going to be? Do you think there's going to be a question of whether he's a good king or a bad king? He's going to be a good king. And so what kind of king, what kind of things will this good king do in this world? Do you think he's going to try to seek to remove all the false worship in every nation, every religion, every denomination, and every church, and restore true worship in his name? Do you think the good king is going to do that? Absolutely he is. See, Yeshua's coming, Messiah's coming, does not change God's definition of worship. The living word is not going to undermine or throw out what is clearly spelled out in the written word. Because if he did, he would not be a good king. If he did, if Yeshua gives his followers permission to worship in any way that they want, on any day that we want, then he cannot be Messiah. Because he would be breaking the Torah. He would be sinning against the word of God. According to 1 John 3:4, sin is lawlessness. Sin is the breaking of the Torah. And if Yeshua did that, he wouldn't be a good king. He would be much more like the Antichrist that Daniel 7 talks about. When it talks about him, it says he will speak words against the Most High and will continually harass the saints, the Kedoshim of the holy ones of the Most High, and he will try to change what? The appointed times and the law. The Kedoshim will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. This is in Aramaic, but the Hebrew equivalent is the Antichrist is going to change the Moedim, the feast days. the appointed times, and he's going to change the Torah. The Antichrist is going to try to change worship and make everybody into workers of lawlessness. People who are living without the authority of the Torah. Now, I'm saying all that, and I'm under no illusions. We don't do everything perfect here. We don't do everything right here at Restoration. There's some things that we can't do here. And I understand there are plenty of things that he is going to correct in us when he comes. But the more that he shows us, the more that we read, the more that we must seek to conform our practice to his word. And if we know what he's going to change it to, if we know where he's going, if we know where he is honored when the feast days like Passover are restored. He is honored when Sabbath is restored. Then let's move in that direction. Doesn't that make sense? Let's start being like some of the good kings that, yes, they removed some of the high places. Yes, they started doing many of the other things that the Torah requires. We may not be perfect because many of them said, yeah, they did all this good stuff. They just didn't get up there to the high places to tear all that stuff down. They didn't fix everything, but man, they were moving in the right direction. Let's move toward the kingdom of Messiah and the new Jerusalem. Right? That's where we're going. Because he knows what is true worship. He knows that far better than any of us. He's expressed his will and his desire for certain forms of worship. And he is the only one with the authority to say what his people should do. And we don't get to change it based on what we want. King Yeshua HaMashiach will not have a different standard because we don't have the authority to change it, nor can we define worship. And all of us, every congregation even, has to navigate this world that is trying to convince us that God doesn't care. Did God really say is really what God doesn't care sounds a lot like. Did God really say, worship Adonai your God and serve him only? Did he say that? Yes, he did. Is he the same yesterday, today, and forever? Yes, he is. Yeshua did not open the door, didn't give permission to do whatever. The apostles didn't start their own places of worship and throw out all that stuff. They actually continued to go to the temple for as long as they were alive and as long as they were allowed. And the Gentiles being added, to this group, they were not allowed to bring their idolatry, their pagan practices with them and say, this is now acceptable worship. Rather, they were, like in Acts 15, supposed to be in the synagogues on what day? On the Shabbat. And what were they supposed to be listening to? Hearing Torah, hearing Moses as he defined what true love and devotion was, because they had no idea what it was before. That's what you and I still need to be doing. That's what you and I, still need to be fighting to make it a part of our future, part of our families, part of, whatever. If, there's going to be people or different ways of trying to keep you from doing it God's way. And you have to decide what way you're going to worship. Because the Torah draws the line of what's in or what's out. Not what we want, not what our culture says is okay, not what we grew up doing. Because he really does care how we worship him.